I also have the sense, and this is a sense born of personal interactions with various figures in the religious world, theological world, and the intellectual universe. We just came back from a trip to Scotland and London, where we engaged with a number of leading voices in all of these areas. And I was surprised by how many individuals expressly want to dissociate themselves from Christianity, but want to continue their quest for God. But they feel like the inheritance of Western Christianity is just so fraught with conceptions of an angry, retributive God whose paramount concern is justice and equity, that I feel that there is an openness to the version of Christianity that I'm trying to narrate. It's also the case that the Christians across the denominational spectrum are converging in growing numbers on what used to be considered uniquely Mormon heresies. David Bentley Hart has talked about pre-existence. You have representatives of almost every church on the planet who are now saying, no, God has to have a more generous, capacious plan for those who die without hearing the gospel. We don't have really good reason to believe that God has foreordained vast multitudes to hell. There have to be better ways of enlarging and universalizing Christ and his message. So, yeah, I don't feel that I'm setting up an us versus them kind of conflict. I think it was the great novelist Marilyn Robinson who said, nothing productive about God has ever been said from a position of defense. And so that's why I don't write this book as an apologetic or as a defense. I write it as a genuine attempt to assess where Christianity has really shown and where it has really failed, and what possibilities are open for better versions of Christianity in the future.
Was there anything you found that you felt was maybe contrary to the teachings of the LDS Church?
I guess what may surprise some Latter-day Saint readers who read this text would be we do have a number of mythologies that we have just kind of inherited and developed through sometimes extrapolating from what we know and assuming we know more than we do about the early Christian church. We talk about primitive Christianity or early Christianity as if it were a coherent, stable, centralized body. And that just wasn't the case. There wasn't internet, there weren't phone lines, there wasn't a Pony Express. So when you talk about Christianity, especially in the first century or even the second, what you're really talking about are disparate home churches that came to Christianity through particular preachers like Sir Paul or Pete or John. And what we see in the letters of Paul, what we see in like the first epistle of John especially, are alarm bells that, wait, you're teaching the wrong thing in this area. And this group is teaching this wrong thing. You got Gnostics, you got Docetists, you got all kinds of variations on a theme. And so I think that's one of the first myths we need to dispel, that there was this stable, fully organized, intact church. And then there's a falling away and dissipation. No, there were beautiful truths taught from the beginning, and there were crazy errors introduced from the beginning. Similarly, as we go through the history of Christianity, as Latter-day Saints, we often suggest by our rhetoric that after the apostasy, there was this total eclipse of darkness and no truth anywhere on the earth. And Joseph Smith said that Revelation chapter 12 was an allegory of the apostasy. And in that story that is narrated in Revelation chapter 12, the church is said to retreat into the wilderness where it was nourished for a time. And then when Joseph effects the restoration, the language of Scripture reflects that understanding. He says that the church is being brought out of the wilderness. Now think about that image. He's not saying God imports the church again. He's saying the church is being assembled out of the wilderness, which I take to mean, and early Latter-day Saints took to mean, that there are bits of truth that have always been scattered throughout the world. Part of Joseph's mission was assembling those, recognizing what God called holy men and women who were speaking that Joseph wasn't even aware of. And so I've tried to illuminate through this history what I think were beautiful, inspired voices, like little sparks of light in the midst of a greater darkness. Whether you're talking about the Cappadocian Fathers in the 4th century, people like Macrina or Julian of Norwich in the 1300s, or Edward Beecher and George MacDonald in the 19th century. There have always been voices who are absolutely in communion with the divine light. And so I want to tell their story as well. There are several times in the Doctrine and Covenants when the Lord tells Joseph, I'll reveal to you things not known from the foundation of the world. So we're not going back to this primeval totality. We are retracing some of our roots and teachings, but there's been continual expansion and development as well. And I'll just mention incidentally, this is one reason why I think there's a readiness on the part of the world for this kind of a book, whether it's mine or someone else's. But we spoke to one figure in Scotland, John Philip Newell, a great writer, scholar. He used to be an ordained priest. And he defrocked himself. He's left his ministry in part over frustration of ways in which he thinks Christianity lost its original vision. And in a book he's written on this subject, the 2 first chapters are about, first, how the church chose Augustine over Pelagius. And Pelagius was this terrific defender of free will and this opponent of original sin and the baptism of infants. And so he thinks Pelagius was a great figure, as do I. And second, he said they extirpated the doctrine of the feminine divine. And he said in early Christianity, at least the version he is most familiar with, Celtic Christianity, the feminine divine is an integral part of Christianity. And the Roman Church excised that. So there's an example of an educated, influential, theologically informed and educated scholar who laments those 2 great losses, as do Latter-day Saints. So as I said, I think there's a more sympathetic audience out there for much of what we teach if we would be speaking to them as fellow Christians instead of restorationists who have the truth and are trying to inform a blighted people.
I think personally that there are some people, and maybe I'm wrong, I don't know, it makes them uneasy to think that the church is still learning precept on precept.
That's absolutely the case. I think maybe my favorite thing that President Nelson ever said was the restoration is a process, not an event. And so I think we need to be awake and alive to that. I think it was the poet Dylan Thomas who first said, education is not the filling of a bucket, it's the lighting of a fire. I'd like to think of the restoration in the same terms. The restoration isn't this deposit of truth that was given to us. The restoration was first and foremost the introduction into the Christian world of the idea that every single individual has access to divine truth through personal revelation. And so the restoration, as I understand it, is a set of resources and incentives and motivations for us to be insatiably curious about God and his plan. I think the restoration has to be an ongoing process, not just of our institution growing line upon line, but of individuals wanting to explore and to engage in genuine inquiry and ask really tough questions. And I remember when I was doing my second book, By the Hand of Mormon, which was a history of the Book of Mormon, and I felt that in order to write this history, it was a history of how the book was packaged, produced, received, the influence it had, how it was understood, characterized by people throughout time. And I felt like I had to read every single anti-Mormon book, tract, article that had ever been published. And that was near possible to do in the year 2000 than it is today. And I remember some people would raise the question with me, are you sure that you want to delve that deeply into anti-Mormonism and into hostile attacks? And my my answer was, well, if the Book of Mormon is what we claim it to be, then it's resilient enough to survive those kinds of attacks. And it turned out that, to my perception, it was. And so that's why I think, we were told by I think was it Henry Eyring, you'll never have to believe anything that isn't true. And if we could just go forward with that attitude, ask any question you want. You'll never have to believe anything that isn't true.
I love that. I haven't heard that. So when you were working on this project, did you have any like really special spiritual experiences to you that strengthened your testimony of not just Jesus Christ, but also of the church?
Well, I would say that the process of writing this book was a series of cumulative experiences. I didn't have any, Paul on the road to Damascus illuminations. I did just have a consistent series of kind of confirmatory experiences that, yeah, Christianity did get off track. And Latter-day Saint teachings and doctrines do give us the resources to correct the ship. But it also gave me the feeling that even as a church, we still have a lot of hard work ahead of us. And I don't feel that as a culture, because there's always this tenuous tension between institutional church and teachings and how we translate that into the cultural norms and practices. And I think we still haven't let the message of John fully sink in. I think we're still hesitant to understand some of the teachings that we get. Some of them are erroneous teachings because of bad translations in the King James Version. So I'm really grateful to see that the church has now officially endorsed other better translations.
Did you find anything that surprised you when you were doing your research?
There was a big cumulative surprise in doing my research. One of the most, to me, striking discoveries was that some of those teachings that at one point in history really set us kind of outside the margins of mainstream Christianity are now being reinvestigated just vigorously by theologians. To give you a concrete example, divine embodiment. So religious historians all agree that in the 19th century, there was what they call a sea change in believing in God's passibility. In other words, the creeds define God as without body parts or passion. And we can quibble about the meaning of passions, but generally that means God can't be moved by something outside of himself. And beginning in the 19th century, there was just an enormous shift that most theologians today say, of course, God can be moved by our pain or our sorrow or our prayers. Well, then it occurred to certain theologians that, well, as we've learned through studies in embodied cognition and embodied emotion, we can't experience emotion without a body. And so the question has been raised, well, then must God have a body in order to experience passion? And suddenly there's just this flurry of books that have come out in the last 20 years. The Embodied God, Heavenly Flesh, does God have a body? So it's not that there is any official stance in Christianity that has changed, but the fact that the question is now being so openly addressed. And the same thing has happened with universalism. Is it really the case that God is going to make salvation available to the entirety of the human family? That question is openly discussed and debated across the Christian spectrum today. I'm just waiting for pre-existence to make its way back into the limelight. That still is kind of there at the margins, but it's getting harder and harder to insist that Latter-day Saintism operates outside of historic Christianity.
You know, it's funny. The other day, I saw a video of just some random content creator talking about the pre-existence. She didn't use that word, but she was talking about it. She was talking about it, that it was a thing. And I was like, wait a second, is this a thing now for them? Like, and another thing that I saw was, this was a couple of years ago, I saw a video of somebody talking about kingdoms in the afterlife within kingdoms, that it's taught in the Bible. And I'm like, this is in the Bible, and why do they get mad at us for believing in this? I just been pretty confused about things, but
it's becoming common. For example, I just got back from Scotland 3 weeks ago, where I spent 10 hours interviewing Ian McGilchrist, probably the world's most famous neuroscientist.
Wow.
And he's written thousands of pages making his case that ultimately his conclusion is that consciousness precedes existence. There was consciousness before there was matter. Matter arises out of consciousness, not the other way around. And I asked him the question point blank. I said, so if we thought of that consciousness as being individuated, would that mean that we as human spirits could have existed before we were incarnate as human beings? And he said, yeah, that makes sense to me. That seems to be a possibility. So that's just another example of coming from another direction. Suddenly this wild Mormon idea seems a serious contender for attention. And then, of course, the feminine divine, right? People all over the place are talking about the feminine divine, not just in terms of contemporary theology, but in terms of historical studies, right? There's not just this general recognition. You can even find books with the title, God Had a Wife, or another one, Did God Have a Wife? And there's a recognition that in the ancient Middle East, that the feminine divine was an important part of worship, and so on.
Thank you so much for being here. If you enjoyed this content, please like, subscribe, and share. The Be Faithful podcast is not endorsed or sponsored by The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This is my personal attempt to share the light of Jesus Christ and to testify that He lives. So please stay tuned for more inspiring conversations. And until next time, keep the faith.